The phrase agentic AI is everywhere now. Product briefings, executive decks, conference keynotes. The problem is that it's being used to describe everything from a glorified workflow assistant to a fully autonomous digital worker that can run parts of the business.
Right. And when retail executives hear it, they don't think slightly smarter RPA. They imagine a capable junior employee, someone that understands a business goal, can weigh options, act across systems, and learn from outcomes. That's a very high bar. And it sets expectations for budget, risk, and speed of transformation.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that this vision is actually pretty close to the stricter research-oriented definition of agentic AI, which is goal-pursuing systems that can perceive context. They can reason, plan, act, and often coordinate with other agents. But in the wild, the label is basically slapped on everything that mixes automation, machine learning, LLMs, and a few API calls.
So, for this conversation, we should be explicit. We'll say agentic AI is the enterprise grade autonomous goal pursuing, and autonomous workflow orchestration, or AWO, is what most retailers really have live today: intelligent orchestrated workflows. But they don't independently decide what the business should optimize for.
Right. And we'll also try to answer these three questions. What's actually running in production today? What's being oversold under the agent label? And what needs to change in architecture, data, and operating model to get from today's AWO to tomorrow's agentic ecosystems?
Right, so let's unpack first the mental model leaders have. When they hear agent, they picture a digital coworker and not a rules engine, but they picture someone who can look at messy inputs and understand the intent, someone who can choose a strategy and then execute across tools without being handheld.
Right. And in technical terms, that's an agent that can hold a representation of a goal, not just a trigger. It can break that goal into a plan using through multiple steps, potentially across systems, and it can decide which API tools or APIs to call and in which order. And it can adjust when reality really diverges from the plan.
And that's important because it changes what leaders expect. If they think they're buying that level of capability, they'll design projects around hand over this outcome to this agent. If in reality they're buying workflow automation with a bit of reasoning on top, they still need humans to own the goal and the edge cases.
Yeah, and here the risk isn't just disappointment, it's basically misallocated responsibility. If you treat an orchestrated workflow as an autonomous decision maker, you may underinvest in guardrails, in monitoring, or human oversight. And when something goes wrong, a pricing error or a supply chain misallocation, you will actually discover that nobody was accountable.
Right. So terminology sets expectations. If agentic AI suggests an autonomous digital manager, but the product is really just a smart workflow, leaders end up planning for the wrong capabilities, and the governance gaps will show up really fast.
Right. So let's go deeper on AWO. Under the skin, AWO is basically a converged stack. It's consisting basically of the following. It's a workflow RPA layer, which orchestrates steps across systems. It consists of ML models, which score risks, classify tickets, forecast demand, detect anomalies, LLM components that read and write structured text, summarize, draft, and converse, integration fabric, APIs, event buses, queues to connect retail and supply chain systems, and rules and the policy layer, which basically consists of constraints, what's allowed, thresholds, and approvals.
Right. And the big shift is from old school automation that we've seen for years, which is based on triggers that are a less brittle, models that can decide when a flow should start. The middle of the process is more intelligent, so LLMs can understand messy emails, PDFs, and images. And then the workflows can branch based on predictions and scores, and they're not just based on static rules.
Right. But notice what's still missing. The system doesn't wake up one morning and say, shrink margin volatility in category X or reduce dwell time in this fulfillment node. It doesn't redesign the flow. It runs the flow it was given, just more flexibly.
Exactly. And in retail terms, AWO looks like given this return request, decide if it's valid and process it end to end, or given this delivery exception, pick the best remediation and execute, or one of my favorites is given this shelf images, detect gaps and trigger a store task.
Yeah, and where it tends to fail is wherever the world doesn't match the assumptions baked into the flow, right? For example, exception types the model hasn't seen, conflicting business rules between systems, or organizational policies that change, but rules weren't updated.
Right, because today's systems are still workflow centric. And fixing issues usually means redesigning the workflow rather than updating an agent's goals or strategies or constraints. So that's really a pivotal difference. One that shows how far we still need to go before we reach true goal driven agentic behavior. So let's walk the spectrum a little more slowly because this is where leaders can benchmark themselves from automation, AWO, to narrow agents to an agentic ecosystem.
Right. So basically, there are stages. Stage one is rules automation. In this stage, think macros, scripts, RPA bots, um, strength, meaning it's predictable and controllable, and weakness, basically that it's brittle and any change in UI or data format breaks it. Stage two is AWO. The system can adapt within the workflow but cannot change the workflow itself. So it's still workflow centric, but with ML and LLMs making smarter decisions inside the flow. The strengths are that it handles more variation, fewer manual handoffs. The weakness is that goals are still externally defined. The flow is still hard coded thinking.
Right, which brings us to stage three, which are narrow agents. And these agents can make decisions based on trade offs and not just rules. So they're domain specific agents and they can reason within a tight scope. So some examples would be a pricing agent that can choose between pre-approved strategies within guardrails, or a disruption management agent that can propose and sometimes execute remediation steps. So here, really, the line between smart workflow and agents starts to blur because the system is making trade-offs instead of just following a script.
Yeah. And stage four, really the ultimate goal is agentic ecosystems. And these agents operate under high level goals, but have autonomy in choosing methods. Basically, there are multiple agents with different roles and partial perspectives. They share goals or negotiate trade-offs, margin versus service level versus inventory risk. And they choose tools and even propose new process variants.
So the important nuance is that most retailers today straddle stage 2 and stage 3. They have AWO in several workflows and a few narrow agent like pilots. But really, the governance and data foundations and the integration patterns are still built around workflows, not around agents that might initiate or reshape the work.
Yeah. And the key takeaway here is you can't jump from rules automation to agentic ecosystems in one step. And each stage introduces new failure modes. From bot broke to workflow made a bad decision to agent optimized for the wrong objective. And leaders also need to be explicit about which stage they're designing for. So let's take the production examples you listed and talk about what they reveal.
Yeah, sure. So let's start with the automated refunds and returns. So the happy path is straightforward. Classify the reason for the return, check the policy, process the return, and notify the customer. But the interesting questions are really who owns the edge cases? So, for example, fraud suspicion, or our favorite, chronic returners, or policy conflicts. Is a system allowed to balance cost versus customer goodwill, or is there still a human decision?
Right. And in most implementations, the system is allowed to automate within a risk band. If the score is less than X, then approve. If it's between X and Y, escalate. If it is greater than Y, block. And that's classic AWO. It's not deciding the business risk appetite, it's just applying it at scale.
Right. And then let's look at computer vision based planogram checks. The AI will spot the gaps on the shelf, and then the workflow creates tasks. So the questions are, can the system reprioritize tasks based on sales impact or labor constraints? And can it propose different merchandising layout based on local behavior?
Usually, no. It's still executing spot the issue to raise the task. Real agentic behavior would be given store A's traffic patterns and sales profile, I'll propose a different display, simulate impact, and roll it out as a test.
So the pattern we're seeing across these use cases is the sense and the act parts are getting smarter and more automated. The decide what game we're playing and what trade-offs are acceptable is really still largely human and static policy.
Right, and that's still the analytical gap. A lot of decks talk about autonomous AI, but when you inspect the design, the autonomy is basically local and tactical. It's not global and strategic. And that's why AWO delivers solid ROI, but doesn't yet change the fundamental operating model.
So let's revisit that future scenario with a bit more rigor now that we've identified some use cases. So a supply chain agent spots a disruption. And that sounds simple, but under the hood, it means it's continuously monitoring data sources across multiple sources of data. And it has a model of what looks normal and what we care about most. And it knows which other agents to notify and what options they have.
Yeah, and then from there, a replenishment agent basically responds. And for that to be meaningful, it has to understand the constraints, the supplier lead times, capacity, contractual obligations. It has to understand the objectives, the service levels per channel, the margin thresholds, the inventory risk tolerances, and it has to be able to simulate options and rank them.
Right. And then now add a margin agent and a store agent and a customer facing agent into that same conversation. So the complexity is going beyond, it's not just more APIs, it's how do they share a consistent view of reality and how do they resolve conflicting goals? And when do they stop and say, hey, we need to ask a human for some help?
Yeah, and that's why this isn't just upgrade your tech stack. It really forces questions like who sets goals and constraints for these agents? And how often are these goals reviewed and adjusted? And how do you audit decisions made by a swarm of agents after the fact?
Right? And practically, that's why we see pilots in tightly bound domains like dynamic pricings within guardrails, or we see localized assortment tuning rather than agents run the entire supply chain. It's not just about model capability, it's about the surrounding governance and the data and the accountability.
Yeah, and it would be really good if we could tie this back to leadership decisions. If you mislabel AWO as full agentic AI, then three things tend to happen. So number one is basically architecture, what we call architecture drift. You bolt agents onto workflow-centric landscape, and they end up acting like fancy decision nodes, not first-class citizens. You never design the shared memory, the goal store, or the event fabric agents really need. Number two is risk blind spots. You assume the agent knows what it's doing and underinvest in observability. For example, can you trace why it did something? In kill switches, can you stop it quickly? In sandboxes, can you safely test new behaviors? And number three is talent mismatch. You hire prompt engineers and ignore the need for people who design machine human workflows and people who define agent goals, constraints, and evaluation metrics.
Right. And from the retail side, there's also a sequencing problem. If you believe you're buying agents, you may skip the unglamorous work of cleaning product location and customer data, super important, rationalizing your process variants, and also standardizing integration patterns across your OMS, your WMS, your ERP, and your e commerce systems.
Yeah, and then the agentic project either stalls or degenerates into a custom one-off that basically can't be scaled. And leaders conclude basically that agents aren't ready when in reality the organization wasn't ready for them to begin with.
Right. So the distinction is autonomous workflow orchestration versus agentic ecosystem. It's not academic. It's the difference really between we're upgrading workflows and need workflow thinkers plus machine learning and large language model skills versus the we're redesigning how decisions are made. And we need people who can design socio-technical systems. So let's get practical here. If you're a CIO or COO or head of digital and your board is asking about agentic AI, what should you do in the next 12 to 18 months?
That's a very important question. And let's explore the answer basically in multiple parts. First, exploit AWO fully. So start by identifying 5 to 10 high volume rules heavy flows, such as returns, order exceptions, vendor queries, store tasks. Then redesign them explicitly as AWO. Clear inputs, outputs, KPIs, and where machine learning and large language models can add value, and instrument them so you can measure cycle time reduction and error rates and customer impact.
And then, secondly, consciously design one or two narrow agent pilots. So, pick a domain where the objective is clear and the risk is bound. So, pricing within a range, or markdown optimization, or localized assortment tuning. And then let the agent propose actions inside guardrails and use humans approving at first and gradually move to exception only review. And then treat these as experiments in autonomy, not just new tools. And then make sure to capture what breaks. So, data issues, policy conflicts, or even trust problems that come up.
Right. And then thirdly is to start the agent readiness groundwork. So uh, look at the data, define which data an agent would need uh, to see in order to act cross-functionally. The events move from nightly batches to event streams for key signals. And governance, define an autonomy matrix which decisions can be fully automated, which require human review, and which must stay human only for now.
So if you do these three things, you're not just dabbling in AI, you're building the scaffolding to move from today's orchestrated pilots to really tomorrow's more autonomous autopilot without betting the company on buzzwords.
Yeah, and let's reframe what progress is really in retail AI. So the headline isn't agentic AI is years away, so wait. The headline should be retail is in an AWO phase that is already valuable. And the way you do AWO either sets you up for agentic ecosystems or makes them much harder later.
Right. And if your AWO is opaque and brittle and glued to one application at a time, it becomes a dead end. If your AWO is instrumented, integrated, and governed, then it really becomes a training ground for your agents. And the same tech building blocks, completely different strategic outcomes.
Yeah, and for leaders, the question is less, do I have agents yet? and more am I designing today's automation so that more autonomy is possible later if I choose it?
And if the answer is yes to that, then you're on the right side of the buzz. Using today's capabilities to build a real path to tomorrow's autonomous retail.
Yeah. And that concludes our conversation. Thanks everyone for joining.
Stay curious because the evolution for automation to autonomy is shaping the next decade of retail.